Good evening and welcome to this year's rather unusual Phoebe Rees Awards. Unusual because there's no bar to prop up, no fellow thespians to chat to, no meal being served, and no one's wearing a black tie. Or maybe you are. Mainly it's unusual because although by the beginning of March we had 26 entered in the competition and no doubt more to follow, we were only able to adjudicate 12 before the balloon went up, or rather the curtain came down. You'll remember that theatres were closed by order of the government on Monday the 16th of March, which happened to be the opening night of Swan Theatre Company's Night Must Fall. I felt terribly sorry for their cast and crew. And for all those other societies with productions in the pipeline. So disappointing for everyone involved. Anyway, we've decided to celebrate those 12 which made it before the pandemic restrictions closed us all down. And we are delighted that you've been able to join us tonight to remember the fun you had bringing them from page to stage. From her home in Bradford-on-Avon is Liz Hollis.
Hello there.
And from across the other side of the county in Burnham-on-Sea is June Jenkins.
Hi.
Both Liz and June joined the panel as adjudicators 2 years ago. Also on the panel this year has been Lynn Lockyer, our moderator for the year 2018-19. And she returned to adjudicating this past season, much to my relief because we were very stretched with having such a small panel. Lynn was very much involved in the selection of this year's winners in all the various categories. But it was during that meeting a couple of weeks ago that she got the devastating news of her father's sudden illness. Sadly, he's since died, which is why Lynn cannot be here with us tonight for obvious reasons. Our thoughts are with her and with her family at this very sad time. So the format for tonight's awards is that each of the adjudicators will tell us a bit about the production they adjudicated, illustrated by the photographs which some of you very kindly sent in. It so happens that each of us adjudicated 3, which works out very neatly, and that Liz, June and Lynn each went along as a moderator for each of the 3 that I went to see. You'll be hearing rather a lot from me tonight because I shall do my best to cover Lynn's work as well as my own, since the other 2, of course, didn't see those plays. And then in the last part of the evening, I shall show you the nominations we made in each category, and in my role as moderator, I'll announce the winners as we go along. So first, we're going to hear from Liz, who went to Wells to see Little Theatre's Anne of Green Gables.
A dramatisation of the novel by Lucy Maud Montgomery, written around the turn of the 20th century and set in Newfoundland. This has long been a children's classic. It tells the story of orphaned Anne Shirley, who at the age of 11 is sent to live with Matthew Cuthbert and his spinster sister Marilla. They had advertised for a boy to help on the farm and are rather put out when an extremely talkative and rather opinionated little girl gets off the train. But of course, she gradually steals their hearts and ours. The play covers Anne Shirley's early years at school, her sometimes stormy relationship with Gilbert Blythe, pictured in the centre of the row, whom she later marries in the book, and her many adventures along the way, ending with Matthew's death and Anne's getting a place at the college she'd always dreamt of. This isn't an easy play to stage, mainly because it requires a large cast of both adults and children, and also because it's so episodic. I believe this was director Bobby Bass's first production, and she did do a remarkably good job, maintaining pace and energy throughout. Not easy when you have so many youngsters to organise. There was good support from the technicians on lighting and sound, and the set was particularly well built and very imaginatively designed to provide the different acting areas. The farmhouse kitchen, Anne's little bedroom, Rachel Lynn's cottage, the countryside and various other locations. The rooftop silhouetted against the skyline was particularly deftly achieved and very effective. Bobby elicited some fine performances from her cast. I was particularly struck by Doreen Grant as Marilla, although her wig did her no favours. Her upright posture and pursed lips reflected a puritanical, unbending nature, which thawed a little as the play unfolds. Ken Edmonds gave us a nicely nuanced performance as her brother Matthew, his natural reserve and shyness gradually melting to reveal the more confident, rounded character beneath. Emma James, as Marilla's friend Rachel Lynde and local busybody, was a delight, popping out of her cottage doorway at intervals to deliver her memorable catchphrase, "If you want my opinion, which I'm sure you don't," a great sense of comic timing. Sarah Stott made an impression in the small role of Mrs. Blewett. But the main honours must go to Matilda Friend as Anne Shirley herself. Only 12 at the time, she gave a remarkably mature performance in the leading role, carrying the play with confidence, with good projection, and bringing sensitivity to the role, and winning over the hearts of both the Cuthberts and her audience. All in all, a thoroughly enjoyable production, to which we gave no less than 8 nominations. These will be revealed later when we look at each category.
In October, Lynn went along to adjudicate Cold Comfort Farm, presented by West Huntsville players. Lynn told us in the preamble to her adjudication that the novel by Stella Gibbons was one of her all-time favourites. She knew the version dramatised by Paul Doost, but not this one by Sally Hedges. She thought it was a brave choice for West Huntsville, well outside their comfort zone, because it was a difficult play to stage in the Balliol Hall, but she applauded their ambition. And she thought that under June Jenkins' able direction, the whole team had really pulled it off. Unusually for West Huntsville players, the tabs were open from the outset, and she greatly admired the composite set, with its grubby walls and peeling plasterwork, the tremendous attention to detail and the selection of props, and the unobtrusive stage management, much of it being done by the cast themselves. So that the flow of the play was very well maintained. Lynn singled out several performances for special mention. She particularly liked Vicky Dean's highly organised Flora Post, and she thought Alan Jarvis's Adam was a delight, one of the best roles she's seen in play. And she was very impressed with his amazingly dirty costume. She said she could almost smell him. Alistair Murray also scored highly as usual as Snella the butler. Tanya Lee made quite an impression in the comic role of Miriam, and Monica Baker as Mrs. Beetle held her own very well in all the mayhem. Here's a selection of photos taken at the dress rehearsal to give you a flavour of the production, which clearly went down very well with their capacity audiences and got 11 nominations in all. This is Alistair Murray as Snella, butler to Aunt Mary, played by Janet Holderness. Claire Virgo played cousin Judith Starkadder. Reuben Starkadder, played by Dan Webber, and Vicky Dean as Flora. Adam, played by Alan Jarvis, with Vicky Dean as Flora. He's telling her about Aunt Ada upstairs. And here is Aunt Ada, played by Judith James, ruminating about something nasty. Amos Starkadder, played by Steve Taylor, preaching to the quivering brethren. And this is second son Seth, played by Greg Fear, leaving for Hollywood, despite his mother's desperate pleas to stay behind. This is Miriam, Flora, and Mrs. Beetle. And here in the middle is Miriam's true love, Irk, played by Matthew Taylor, seen here with Judith and with Amos. And here's a touching moment when Adam gives Elphine, played by Amy Taylor, his wedding present of a nest with 4 birds' eggs in it. And last but by no means least, the surprise appearance of the bull, looking remarkably like Phil Crossland. And the next production was Undermilt Wood, seen by Liz at Ilminster.
Unfortunately, we were unable to get hold of any photos for this production. but here is the poster which Ilminster used to advertise it. First broadcast by the BBC in 1954, the year after Dylan Thomas died, Under Milk Wood was written as a play for voices, part play, part poem. It has been read, staged and filmed, but above all, it is meant for the ear. However presented, it needs the ability from the actors to share with the audience the verbal subtlety, the rhythm and music of the poetry, while at the same time bringing out the wonderful characterizations, the humour and vitality of the piece. Not a lot happens. There's no plot as such, but the succession of vignettes paints a picture of the inner lives of the local inhabitants of the fishing village of Flarigo, their joys and sorrows, dreams and foibles, flavoured with sensitivity and delicious humour. The decision to reenact it as if performed by a small group of the author's friends who come together for a public reading in the lounge bar of Brown's Hotel, a watering hole much frequented by Thomas, was an interesting and brave one, relying on a cast of just 6 to play a huge number of characters. This, together with the allocation of roles, was designed to mirror the first public performance given in New York in 1953. The idea of creating the feeling of a play within a play by giving the cast scripts to read from was equally interesting, although it didn't quite come off, as there was a bit of inconsistency in the turning of pages and the way in which the scripts were used much more obviously during the second half of the play. Set and props were carefully thought out, evocative of a space that was something between lounge and public bar, with some nice touches such as the dartboard turning round to become the porthole window of Captain Cook's schooner house. Lighting generally helped to create both atmosphere and time of day, from pre-dawn through to dusk, and there was nice use of candlelight at the start and end of the play. Costumes were in keeping with how the average people in a small Welsh town in the 1950s might have dressed. Nothing too startling. In terms of direction, the acting area was used effectively for the many vignettes. Pace was mainly good, as were the general standard of acting, with some nice characterizations. The most versatile performance, however, came from Teresa Ravenscroft, whose poignant portrayal of poor Bessie Bighead was worthy of a nomination on its own, evoking a sigh of pity from the audience. Bessie hardly speaks, but you nailed her, Teresa, with your physical stance and facial expression. Very memorable. Overall, an interesting production with a good deal of thought behind it.
And next we have another adjudication done by Lynn. This was for When We're Married, presented by Toronto Thespians at the Brew House in November 2019. This was Lynn's second adjudication of the season, and a play which she knows well, having directed it for Ilminster. She thought it would suit Toronto Thespians, and the Brew House staged nicely, and indeed it did. She wrote, "When the tabs opened with the chiming of a clock, it was a delight to see your solidly constructed and well-decorated set. Clearly, the creative team had worked very hard with tremendous attention to detail and done themselves proud in creating the impression of an early Edwardian drawing room, beautifully furnished and dressed with great care. She thought the large central rug was a good colour and pulled the room together beautifully. She reckoned that the period, 1908, had been very well captured, though she thought one of the wigs at least was a little underdressed, and questioned the fact that men were dressed in morning suits for an evening event, and particularly that they all wore bow ties. She also thought that the wives might have been more lavishly dressed for this celebration, although she did say that Maria Helliwell, seated centre, her dress was pretty and suited her well. Lynn was complimentary about Ray Court's direction. She said it was confident with well-executed ideas, that moves were well choreographed, that the cast were well drilled, and that he he had created some delightful tableaux. Moving on to performances, she said that the acting in general was of a high standard, and she particularly liked Andy Busby's portrayal of Alderman Joe Helliwell, standing in this photograph, stage left. The convivial but rather pompous host who kept the piece moving along nicely. She also singled out Dave Goodall, standing stage right, as a henpecked Herbert Soppid, and Lorna Evans as his dominating battle axe of a wife, Clara. Alan Coles also impressed as Henry Ormeroyd, the photographer, and she thought Tim Knowles gave good cameo performance as the Reverend Clement Mercer, not pictured, commenting that it seemed he had stepped straight out of a series of Father Ted. She concluded that the production was a delightful, comedic and warm experience, very much appreciated by the thespian's good-sized audience, judging by the comments she heard all around her. She had nominated it for 7 awards. Now we're going to hear from June.
Last November, I went to see Tickenham Drama Club's production of Alan Bennett's Habeas Corpus, which can be a real romp full of larger-than-life characters and lots of middle-class naughtiness. I'm sure they all had a great deal of fun rehearsing it, and the audience obviously enjoyed their performance enormously. Of course, it's very much a period piece, dating from the late 60s, a sort of sleazy satire on the permissive society, presented cabaret style in the original version. And director Felicity Paris included a raised platform at the back of Dr. Wicksteed's waiting room so that characters who were introduced by the Lady What Does, Mrs. Swab, were bathed in different coloured lights to depict their persona. Felicity chose to update the play, and she cast it extremely well, and there were some excellent performances. In particular, Philip Kingsley Jones as Dr. Wicksteed had the veneer of a respectable GP, but we were in no doubt he was longing for adulterous encounters along the way, and he had the audience laughing throughout with facial expression and his continual asides, which kept us all involved and was spot on. His wife Muriel, played by Becky Kingsley Jones, had us in stitches when she entered in her sexy red dress, supposedly to do cake decorating, and later dons a black rose in her hair, whips the shawl off the sofa, and seductively uses it as a matador's cape to ensnare Mr. Shanks after he'd mistakenly thought Muriel was his customer for false boobs and enthusiastically took photographs of what he thought was his firm's product. Liz Jeffrey played a delightfully nosy Mrs. Swab, who purely by chance finds a girly magazine on top of the Sun's wardrobe and tells Connie a beautiful bust can be hers for only a £5. So we all enjoyed Carol Price's performance as Constance Wicksteed and her complete transformation when her false boobs arrived. She no longer shyly hid her chest behind her oversized cardigan, but flaunted it at the prestigious Sir Percy Shorter as her passion was released to hilarious effect. Poor Mr. Perdue often popped in to try and commit suicide, and we did feel sorry for Dennis, the hapless hypochondriac with long greasy hair and spots. There was such a funny scene with a beautiful Miss Rumpus, when of course Dennis couldn't lie on the grass because of hay fever, or on the rocks because of piles. And talking of the delicious Felicity Rumpus, here she is. What is she doing with Dr. Wicksteed? In the midst of the farce, there is a nostalgic moment when Lady Rumpus describes the World War II bombing in Liverpool, and Cannon Throbbing is enthralled. Sound and lighting was so effective as we hear the air raid sirens and the bombs amidst the darkness with a red glow in the background, so atmospheric, helping us to imagine the fires in Liverpool that night. It was a very entertaining evening, which the audience thoroughly enjoyed. and I'm pleased to say that we gave Tickenham Drama Group a total of 6 nominations.
Next, we have Street Theatre's Mayfly, which I had the pleasure of adjudicating at quite short notice last November, with June as moderator. This is the remarkable debut play by Joe White, which created quite a stir amongst the critics when it was staged at the Orange Street Theatre 2 years ago and earned him Most Promising Newcomer of 2019. The play concerns a family, Ben, Kat and their daughter Loops, who live in rural Shropshire. It is clear from the start that their interrelationships are highly dysfunctional. Ben is a recovering alcoholic. Kat appears to be having an affair, frequently on the phone to someone she calls Babe. And Loops insists on wearing army camouflage uniform at all times. Quickly absorbed into this setup is a young man named Harry, whom we meet at the start of the play when he rescues Ben from the river in which it seems he was trying to drown himself. It takes quite a while to unpick, but eventually we work out that the family have become paralysed by the grief they have all experienced since their son Adam killed himself a year before, to the extent they can no longer communicate effectively with each other. Harry, who seems to become a surrogate for Adam, emerges as the catalyst they desperately need to begin healing. Maybe this is because at the end of the play, he too is able to reveal his long suppressed feelings about his own mother. It is extremely powerful stuff, so fresh and different from the well-worn plays we tend to see performed in amateur theatre. And I felt that we as an audience were totally absorbed. Director Neil Harriance, seen here, had clearly worked intensively with his small cast of exceptional actors, apparently over a 4-month period, and it really paid off. Harry was played by Lachlan Gadd, who was studying performing arts at Stowe College and who clearly understood the importance of listening actively and producing a performance which felt totally real. His onstage phone call to Kat towards the end of the play, pictured here, in which she was able to speak to Adam again, was almost unbearably moving for all of us. Paul Townsend as Ben gave an extremely good portrayal of a man who can see no way forward. He can't seek sympathy from his family because they're completely enveloped in their own grief, and he has nothing left to offer his wife by way of solace. He cannot look her in the eye or even say his son's name. That's pretty bleak. Loops, played by Francesca Fallows, is a fascinating character. It turns out that it was she who found her brother's body. And though she depersonalizes the event by describing him as that dead boy, and she has since created a fantasy which requires her to wear his uniform, a really complex role in which Francesca had clearly invested a great deal. And finally, Karen Trevis as Kat, whom I felt found every grain of truth in her portrayal of the torment of this desperately unhappy woman, which made her performance extraordinarily real and outstandingly moving. As I said in my education at the time, it's a great privilege to be able to see acting of this quality in amateur theatre. Marks for presentation weren't particularly high, except for James Linham's lighting, but it scored heavily on direction and performance with 6 nominations. Bravo. We're getting slightly out of order in terms of when we saw things. June is taking the next slot to give me a break because I adjudicated 2 on the trot. She went to see Barnstormer's Good Night, Mr. Tom down at the Regal Theatre at the beginning of December.
Good Night, Mr. Tom is a children's book written by Michelle Magorian and adapted for the stage by dramatist David Wood. Set in World War II, it follows the story of William Beach, a young evacuee from an abusive home background in London. He is billeted with Tom, a lonely widower in a West Country village. It is wonderful to see this relationship develop, and with Tom's care, an unhappy William starts to enjoy life, while Tom's own life begins to have meaning again. William quickly made a special friend in Zach, played with great energy by Benjamin Johnson, whose exuberance for life shone brightly on stage, especially when he was whizzing around on his 1930s scooter. I thought the play was a real challenge, but Barnstormers definitely pulled it off under Lynn Pearson's direction. We were swiftly transported back to 1939 and the war years by songs from the era and recordings of Neville Chamberlain and Winston Churchill. I really enjoyed seeing the various projections, original Pathé News footage, World War II posters, the station, and these, combined with all the wonderful authentic costumes, complete with gas mask boxes, reminded us constantly that the war was close. Tom's cottage was cosy with his carver placed by the range, and later this was cleverly converted into Mrs. Beech's house in London. I think everyone loved the large ivy-clad tree underneath which Tom sat, accompanied by his loyal sheepdog Sammy. This was a fabulous puppet made by Gary Robinson and brought to life by puppeteer Amy Bullock, who expertly handled Sammy. He barked, wagged his tail, and cocked his head, while Amy moved around the stage unobtrusively and with great skill. There were 7 children in the play, and it appeared that Lynn had given them great encouragement. She had obviously taken time to explain to the children how the more sensitive scenes needed to be played, and they did a marvellous job. I was particularly moved by George Littlefield's performance as William. This was an unusually demanding role, and George was very convincing, especially when William had to go back to visit his mum in London, and the abuse he had suffered at her hands started again. Such emotional scenes were harrowing, but extremely well done. Neil Wilson gave a very genuine performance playing Tom, subtly helping William in so many ways. He eventually rescues William during the blackout from his mum's house in London and brings him home. The Blitz scene was excellent, as we hear the steam train arriving and the bus travelling through London in the blackout, the air raid siren, and then in that wonderful underground shelter, we heard bombs falling. The closing moments of the play brought tears to our eyes when William skipped off happily to his drama rehearsals. Tom is sat on the bench beneath a tree and says, "Hear that, Sammy? He called me Dad." Very moving. We gave this production no less than 15 nominations. Very good work all round.
The week after Mayfly, I went to adjudicate another stunningly good production, this time presented by Swan Theatre Company at the Swan in Yeovil, and Lynn was moderating. Regeneration is based on the first novel in a trilogy by Pat Barker, was dramatised by Nicholas Wright, who's very good at this sort of thing. It concerns Captain William Rivers, a real-life character, like many in the book, who was one of the medical officers at Craig Lockhart Military Hospital in the First World War. It was here that the War Office sent Lieutenant Siegfried Sassoon, presumably for rehabilitation after he wrote his famous declaration about the mismanagement of the war, which had been published in the Bradford Pioneer in July 1917. Also amongst the patients in the hospital, though not under Rivers' care, was Wilfred Owen. The two men became friends, and it was Sassoon who first recognised and encouraged Owen's talent as a poet, helping him with the work for which he's best known, Anthem for Doomed Youth. I commented in my adjudication that this play looked fiendishly difficult, taking place over about 2 years, in a tremendous variety of locations, involving 10 male characters and 1 female, with very little opportunity for doubling. It got its first professional airing in 2014, but as far as I could tell, had never been attempted by an amateur company. However, it was directed for The Swan by Mark Payne, an awesome director who seems to thrive on difficult, and in fact made achieving great quality like this look almost effortless. I'm going to let the photos of this production speak for themselves. This was a facsimile of Sassoon's Declaration, which was projected onto the front gauze when we entered the auditorium. This was a projection of that very well-known World War I image just before the gauze rose at the start of the play. Billy Pryor, played by Cameron Thrower, and this is Billy with Captain Rivers, played by Robert Graydon. Siegfried, played by Liam Beard, in Captain Rivers' office. The Officer's Mess. Captain Burns, here sitting down on the our right of the table. Captain Burns, played by Mark Payne, is about to vomit. And this is the flashback which ensues. This is Siegfried and Wilfred Owen, played by Sebastian Thrower, in the club. This is Will Butcher as Robert Graves, another war poet, of course. This is the prelude to a harrowing scene of something which apparently really happened. Dr. Yelland in Harley Street is about to apply electricity to the mouth of a private soldier, an elderly private soldier named Private Callum. Dave King is playing Dr. Yelland. And this was the extraordinarily harrowing scene, really uncomfortable, where this probe was applied to his mouth, buzzing with electricity whenever it touched his mouth. I think we were all feeling incredibly squeamish as a result. Lastly, the final image of the play, On the Fall of Poppies. You can see several of the soldiers have white face because they represent, well, they are dead at this stage of the war. There were some really good performances, resulting in seven acting nominations, of which more later. And the production scored highly in most other areas, including direction, creative set design, stage management, lighting, and effects. What I haven't been able to show you in these photographs was, however, the quite remarkable sound achieved. This began while we were reading Sassoon's Declaration on the front gauze when we first entered the auditorium. Just the occasional distant crump of a heavy gun, randomly initially, but becoming more and more frequent and pressing, increasing steadily in volume, an assault on our eardrums which was almost painful, and the reverberations of which we could feel throughout our whole bodies. Talk about being softened up by the artillery. And then Mark added yet another level of sensory battering, increasingly horrific black and white images projected onto the gauze. We were left in no doubt at all that war is hell.
In December, I went to see Beauty and the Beast at Ilminster. Based on an 18th century French classic, this version, written by Lucy Kirkwood for the National Theatre, is a fairy tale with a difference. The play pares down the somewhat convoluted original to its essential elements, using the device of a pair of mischievous fairies, one of whom is emphatically French, who act as narrators, telling the story with the assistance of a helpful rabbit, live actors, shadow play, and a certain amount of magic. Not an easy play to stage. Congratulations to Chris Williamson on a worthy directorial debut, and to your production team, of course. A lot of thought had obviously gone into how to portray the different playing areas. The fairy space, the imposing beast's castle, and the cosy family cottage, together with all those magical devices. There was imaginative design and use of space with good pace and plenty of energy. The lighting of the three playing areas was skillfully done, enhancing the fairy tale atmosphere, the stars and the planets, evoking a gasp of appreciation from the audience. Effects generally work well, with a good deal of ingenuity to produce the magic tricks. I particularly liked the food and goblet magically appearing on the table before our very eyes. Costumes were impressively creative. Pink's black pinstripe suit with shiny pink lapels, patent leather shoes and bright pink laces, evocative of an aging fairy. Cecile, beautifully French chic. And the beast's thick body hair appearing to burst out of his frock coat were especially noteworthy, as were the wig, horns and suitably bestial makeup. Moving on to the acting, plenty of energy and physicality was needed, particularly from the fairies, who cleverly balanced this with the impression of being just a touch past it. There were decent performances all round, with special credit going to Maddie Lowe as Rabbit. This was a non-speaking part, apart from a wonderfully tuneless rendition of Silent Night, which brought the house down. You brought every ounce of humour to the part, with lovely use of facial expression. Overall, a clever production of an enchanting tale, and thoroughly deserving of the 5 nominations gained.
The next is Laying the Ghost, which Lynn went to see in Yeovil Civic Players in November. Lynn comments in her adjudication that choosing this play, a lightish comedy by Simon Williams set in a retirement home, represents a return for the Civics to their roots. It was written in 2001, it's already something of a period piece. You might be tempted to update it, but it has built-in obsolescence, in that an essential part of the plot is that our heroine Margot, an actress who is currently celebrating her 70th birthday, was painted as a teenager by Augustus John. Since he died in 1961, the maths doesn't really work unless you're prepared to make major changes or perform it as written. The main protagonists are Margot Buchanan and another retired and rather batty actress, Frida. They're visited in Act 1 by Margot's ex-husband, an aging Lothario called Sir Leo Buchanan, who has since remarried, his current wife being Lady Judith Buchanan, but who's also now having a fling with a younger actress called Sadie, as is his wont. He rather inconveniently dies halfway through the play, despite the valiant attempts of Mrs. Kidd, the manager of the home, to resuscitate him. Leo then returns in Act 2 as a ghost, visible only to Frida, as far as I remember, which forms the basis for some excellent situational comedy in the latter half of the play. Lynn thought the set construction, essentially a large room representing the recreational area of a retirement home leading out to a conservatory, was well up to Civic Players' very high standards, with fitted carpets, magnolia walls, flowery curtains, and authentic-looking wall lights, as well as a wall-mounted TV and lots of photographs, theatrical posters, etc. It all looked very real. She was also complimentary about Richard Walter's carefully plotted direction, though she felt that sometimes Cubite needed to be tightened up in order to bring out the best of the author's quick-fire repartee. And she particularly enjoyed Jo Simpson's portrayal of Frida, which she said showed excellent listening skills and spot-on comic timing. Unfortunately, we have no photos from Civic Players to show you, but we gave it 2 nominations.
In January, I visited Swan Theatre to see Constellations. This fascinating play is a 2-hander, written by Nick Payne. It is essentially a love story, but it is told in short fragments, some of them lasting only 30 seconds or so, each subtly different from the last, as though these 2 people, Roland and Marianne, are exploring their relationship in an infinite series of parallel universes, which of course gives them any number of potential outcomes. I found this thought-provoking, and I'm sure many of us, reflecting on our own lives, will have wondered sometimes, what if, or if only? The challenge for Pete Fernandez as director was to ensure that the audience were not too confused by the play's structure, nor bored by the repetition of so many very similar scenes, differentiating between universes and indicating that we'd moved from one to another was always going to be difficult. But Pete solved this very neatly by introducing a colourful scenic feature upstage of a totally black set. Some of us saw it as a honeycomb, others a complex molecule. Every time the scene changed, there was a sort of game show sound, a change in the sequence of chase lights around the structure, and a new colour suffusing the upstage gauze, often reflecting the mood of the new situation. Very clever and really very effective. The play must also have been extremely challenging for both actors. Neither of them left the stage during the 75 minutes of playing time, and they had to pick their way through a myriad of scenes where the dialogue was almost identical, but the tone was very different. Elizabeth Lewis played Marianne, an astrophysicist who ranged from amusing and flirty in one take to sombre and thoughtful in another. Suffering from a malignant brain tumour in one set of universes, with attendant word-finding difficulties, and the decision to go and end her life at Dignitas with Roland's support, while being told in another that her tumour is benign. Her joy at this news was touching, and the audience, of course, breathed a sigh of relief that at least one potential outcome was a happy one for both of them. We gave this production a total of 5 nominations.
And lastly, Death Trap, presented by Taunted Thespians in March 2020. This was the very last of this season's crop, slipping in under the wire, in a manner of speaking, with a final performance at the Brewhouse on Saturday the 14th of March. I was adjudicating and Liz came along as moderator. I'm sure that many of us felt slightly uneasy sitting together in the auditorium that week, but the theatre was at least half full, showing that even a relatively old chestnut like this retains its ability to draw people in, and we very quickly forgot any of our disquiet. Death Trap is described by its author, R11, as a comedy thriller. He packed it full of unexpected plot twists designed to shock, and I reckon it's essential that the pace is very carefully managed. The comedic touches used just to lull us and give us some relief, so that the big surprises catch us out and thrill us, just like it says on the tin. The play's director, Jane Leakey, managed all this very deftly. The first big surprise was waiting behind those glowing red front tabs, and when they opened, there was a spontaneous round of applause, not heard very often nowadays, but very well deserved. The set really was impressive, especially the timber framing and the large, typically New England fieldstone fireplace. From the left in this picture was Clifford, played by Matt Ward, Alan Coles playing Sydney, and Lindsay Cran playing Sydney's wife, Mara. The set was also furnished very well and dressed with the most amazing variety of old weapons, few of which were going to be practical, of course. In this picture, Sydney is wasting no time garroting Clifford, of course, in rehearsal. He gets Mara to help carry the body out. Not long after this, their psychic neighbour, Helga Tendorp, arrives, played by Leanne Drew, providing a bit of light relief. And in Act 2, we meet the 5th member of the cast, Sydney's lawyer, Porter Milgrim, played by Neil Morgan. I hope it isn't too much of a spoiler to reveal that Clifford, apparently having been buried in the vegetable patch, suddenly reappears through the curtains behind the desk, which were drawn across the glazed terrace doors, looking utterly gruesome, and attacking Sydney with a log from the wood pile outside. It certainly made the audience gasp in a very satisfying way. After the interval, with Mara out of the way and her money safely in Sydney's bank account thanks to Porter, Clifford can move in. But it isn't long before he and Sydney are at each other's throats again, this time for real. Sydney manages to get the upper hand and shoots him with a crossbow. But of course it isn't over. We still have Clifford's revenge to enjoy, and then a final squabble between Helga and Porter, the only 2 survivors. Taunted Thespians had a great backstage team, posing here with the cast, whom they outnumber. What a luxury. and I thought that Jane Leakey, pictured here with the cast around her, did a grand job. We gave Death Trap a total of 9 nominations, the first of which, not surprisingly, was for effects. And now, as promised, the nominations. The first is for Best Effects, for which there were 5 nominations: Regeneration from Swan Theatre Company, Goodnight Mr. Tom from Barnstormers, Beauty and the Beast from IES, Constellations, again from Swan Theatre Company, and lastly Death Trap from Drawn Thespians. Slightly unusually, we decided not to award this to a production which relied heavily on projections, although there was some splendid work in that area. But in this case, on one where makeup played an important part in our enjoyment of the play itself. And that, of course, was Death Trap by Taunton Thespians. And next we have Best Sound, where there are 3 nominations: Regeneration again, Habeas Corpus from Tickenham Drama Group, and Goodnight Mr. Tom, Barnstormers. It'll come as no surprise, judging in view of what I said about Swan Theatre Company's extraordinary use of sound in the softening up process at the beginning of Regeneration. Best Sound goes to Swan Theatre Company. Nominations for Best Lighting were Mayfly, presented by Street Theatre Company, Regeneration again from Swan Theatre Company, Beauty and the Beast by Ilminster Entertainment Society, and Constellations by Swan Theatre Company. You'll remember us showing you photographs of the scenic feature and the extraordinary effect that had on the quality of our enjoyment of this unusual play, and the award goes to Constellations, Swan Theatre Company. Now, Best Props, just 2 in this category: Goodnight Mr. Tom by Barnstormers and Death Trap, Taunton Thespians. Now, Taunton Thespians with Death Trap produced the most extraordinary range of props, but we felt that the work done by the props department, and particularly in the making of the props in Goodnight Mr. Tom, notably the chickens and Sammy, the squirrel whom we didn't see, and the little sparrow, as well as all the other props that went to make this an extraordinarily effective period production, was the Barnstormers production, and they are the winners tonight. Goodnight Mr. Tom by Barnstormers. Again, just 2 productions in the Best Costumes category. They were Goodnight Mr. Tom by Barnstormers and Beauty and the Beast by Ilminster Entertainment Society. While we recognised the effort required to produce such a large number of period costumes, 40s, late 30s, early 40s costumes for Goodnight Mr. Tom was a remarkable feat, we also felt that the effort, the creative effort in putting together the costumes for Beauty and the Beast earned them the award for Best Costumes tonight. And now Best Stage Management. 3 nominations: Coal Comfort Farm, West Huntsville Players, Regeneration, Swan Theatre Company, and Death Trap, Taunton Thespians. All 3 required a great deal of work in terms of best stage management, but what has impressed us most about the winner was the fact that the cast themselves worked so well and were so well choreographed in arranging for this very complex set to be moved quickly and efficiently and almost scarcely not noticed by the audience. That was, of course, Coal Comfort Farm by West Huntsville Players. Now we come to Best Set Construction, and there were some magnificent sets amongst the 12 productions that we saw. Anne of Green Gables made a big impression on us. That was presented by Wells Little Theatre. When We're Married by Taunton Thespians. Laying the Ghost by Civic Players, and Death Trap by Taunton Thespians. It was a close run thing, but we felt in the end that the work done to produce the very effective set for Death Trap earned them the award for Best Set Construction. And now Best Creative Set Design, which is quite a different thing altogether. This is to do with making best use of the stage by being creative in the way they made the set work to suit the play. And we had 5 qualified in this category. Anne of Green Gables, again by Wells Little Theatre, Regeneration, Swan Theatre Company, Goodnight Mr. Tom, Barnstormers, Constellations, Swan Theatre Company, and Death Trap, Taunton Thespians. And the winner here was Anne of Green Gables by Wells Little Theatre. Now we come to the last of this section of nominations categories, and this is for Best Artistic Impression, where we have Cold Comfort Farm by West Huntsville Players, When We Are Married, Taunton Thespians, Regeneration, Swan Theatre Company, and Goodnight Mr. Tom. And without any doubt at all, we all felt that Goodnight Mr. Tom should be the winner tonight. And now we turn to the acting awards, beginning with Best Youth Under 16. There were some lovely performances by younger actors in this crop of 12 productions. The first was Matilda Friend as Anne Shirley in Anne of Green Gables from Wells Little Theatre. George Littlefield as William in Barnstormers' Goodnight Mr. Tom, and Benjamin Johnson as Zach, also in Goodnight Mr. Tom from Barnstormers. All 3 gave very impressive performances for one so young. They were all presumably around 10, 11, 12. But our winner undoubtedly was Matilda Friend as Anne Shirley. Now we turn to Best Youth Under 21. There weren't in fact any females under 21 as far as we know, but there was some very impressive performances from these 3 young men. Lochran Gadd as Harry in Street Theatre Company's Mayfly, and Liam Beard as Siegfried Sassoon, and Will Butcher as Robert Graves, both from Swan Theatre Company's Regeneration. And the winner was Lochran Gadd as Harry. Next we come to Best Female Cameo. 4 nominations here. Sarah Stott as Mrs. Blewett in Anne of Green Gables from Wells Little Theatre. Monica Baker as Mrs. Beetle from West Huntsville Players' Cold Comfort Farm. Christine Peters as Gladys, and I think the billeting officer from Goodnight Mr. Tom, Barnstormers, and Maddie Lowe as Rabbit in Ilminster Entertainment Society. And the performance which impressed us most was Maddie Lowe as Rabbit. And now Best Male Cameo. We have Alistair Murray as Sneller in West Huntsville's Cold Comfort Farm. Tim Knowles as the Reverend Clement Mercer in Thespians' When We Are Married. Mark Payne as Captain Burns in Swan Theatre Company's Regeneration, and Clive Wooldridge as Mr. Stelton in Goodnight Mr. Tom from Barnstormers. It's interesting that both our cameo awards go to non-speaking parts this year, and this one undoubtedly goes to Mark Payne as Captain Burns for his extraordinary performance in Regeneration. Moving on to Best Featured Female Actor. These These were Emma James as Mrs. Rachel Lind, the neighbour in Anne of Green Gables from Wells Little Theatre. Tanya Lee as Miriam. Well, actually, that's not Miriam, it's Merriam. Tanya Lee as Merriam is in West Huntsville's Cold Comfort Farm. Amy Bullock as Sammy in Barnstormer's Goodnight Mr. Tom. And Cheryl Thomasgood as Mrs. Beach in Barnstormers. And the winner is Emma James as Rachel Lind. Now we come to Best Featured Male Actor. There are 5 in this category. Alan Coles as Henry Ormonroyd, the photographer in When We Were Married by Taunton Thespians. Sebastian Thrower as Wilfred Owen in Swan Theatre Company's Regeneration. Brian Williams as Callan in Swan Theatre Company's Regeneration. Neil Morgan as Porter Milgrim in Thespians' Death Trap. And James Locke as Dennis in Tickenham Drama Group's Habeas Corpus. And without a shadow of a doubt, for a performance which we feel was perhaps the best piece of acting we've seen on the amateur stage for many a year, with Brian Williams as Callan in Swan Theatre Company's production of Regeneration. Now we come to Best Supporting Female Actor. Again, 5 nominations. Lorna Evans as Clara Soppit in Thespians When We Were Married. Carol Price as Connie Wicksteed in Tickenham Drama Group's Habeas Corpus, along with Chloe Thurlow as Felicity Rumpers in the same play by Tickenham Drama Group. Jo Simpson as Frida Deacon in Civic Players' Laying the Ghost. And lastly, Lynn Wooldridge as Mrs. Fletcher and also the hospital sister in Goodnight Mr. Tom by Barnstormers. And the winner was Carol Price as Connie Wicksteed from Tickenham Drama Group. Now, Best Supporting Male Actor included Ken Edmonds as Matthew Cuthbert in Anne of Green Gables from Wells. Alan Jarvis as Adam in West Huntsville Players' Cold Comfort Farm. Dave Goodall as Herbert Soppit in Thespians When We Were Married. And Cameron Thrower as Billy Pryor in Swan Theatre Company's Regeneration. And the winner here was Alan Jarvis as Adam, West Huntsville Players. And now we come to Best Female Actor. 5 nominations. Doreen Grant as Marilla Cuthbert from Wells. Vicky Dean as Flora Post from West Huntsville. Karen Trevis as Kat, Street Theatre Company. Becky Kingsley Jones as Muriel Wicksteed. And Elizabeth Lewis as Marianne, Swan Theatre Company. All 5 gave terrific performances, but the one that stands out for me, the one that moved me and impressed me, was the highly nuanced performance that Karen Trevis gave as Kat in Mayfly. Congratulations to her. As for Best Male Actor, we have 6 nominations. Andy Busby as Joe Helliwell in When We're Married. Paul Townsend as Ben in Mayfly. Robert Graydon as Captain Rivers in Regeneration. Philip Kingsley Jones as Dr. Arthur Wicksteed in Habeas Corpus. Neil Wilson as Mr. Tom Oakley in Goodnight Mr. Tom from Barnstormers. And Oliver Delafield as Roland in Constellations. And the winner, we felt, was Andy Busby as Joe Halliwell. And now the George Crocker Trophy. This is an award made every year to an individual or a society who have taken on a particular challenge and met it successfully. This year we chose Roberta Bass, first time director, we understand, for Wells Little Theatre's Anne of Green Gables. West Huntsville Players for their most amusing and successful Cold Comfort Farm, Chris Williamson for taking on the enchanting but oh so difficult Beauty and the Beast for Ilminster, and Amy Bullock, who was the puppeteer for Sammy the sheepdog in Goodnight Mr. Tom. And our choice is Amy Bullock. June Jenkins, who was the adjudicator for this production, said that she felt that Amy could easily have had a place in a professional production like Warhorse. So skillful was she in making Sammy come to life. Exceptional work. Well done. And now the Marie Gannicott Award, which is made each year for what we like to call the champagne moment, or the coup de théâtre if you prefer. This is an event, a situation in a production which the audience and the adjudicator, of course, clearly responded strongly to, and one hopes found very memorable. This year we chose Feeding Aunt Ada, a beautifully choreographed section of West Hunsville's Cold Comfort Farm, and also, of course, the hilarious appearance of the bull in that same production, which had the audience in stitches, as you can imagine. We also chose the opening bombardment in Regeneration, an extraordinarily effective artillery barrage, which softened us up for the production. And at the end, since this was very close to Armistice Day, of course, in November, The Fall of Poppies. And lastly, Clifford's resurrection, when he appears through the terrace window in Death Trap. And it was this last that we have selected this year for the Marie Gannicott Award because of the effect his resurrection, so-called, had on the audience. They gasped in shock at this, which was really beautifully managed, cleverly done. Congratulations. Which brings us to Best Direction. 4 nominees: June Jenkins for Cold Comfort Farm, Neil Howience for Mayfly, Mark Payne for Regeneration, and Jane Leakey for Death Trap. All 4 of these directors clearly experienced, clearly very able, but the one we selected as our winner this year was Neil Howience for his extraordinarily sensitive production of Mayfly. And now the Gordon Neagle Memorial Cup. This cup is awarded every year in memory of Gordon Neagle, who was an extraordinarily enthusiastic participant in amateur theatre and well known for travelling around the county, putting on plays in extraordinary situations. He would have very much approved of the fact that we nowadays award it to the best non-theatre production. And in this case, there were 2 societies whose productions were done in village halls rather than theatres. They were West Huntsville Players with Cold Comfort Farm and Tickenham Drama Group with Habeas Corpus. The marks were close, but in the end, the winner was West Huntsville Players for Cold Comfort Farm. Which brings us finally to Best Production. 4 outstanding plays this year, which quite frankly could well have headed a much bigger list of Best Productions if we'd had the whole Phoebe Rees competition as it was originally intended for this year. They were, of course, Mayfly, Street Theatre Company, Regeneration, Swan Theatre Company, Goodnight Mr. Tom, Barnstormers, and Death Trap by Taunton Thespians. As I said, all 4 were extremely fine pieces of work, but the one which stood out for me was undoubtedly Regeneration by Swan Theatre Company. Congratulations to everyone involved. Which brings us to the end of tonight's presentations. I'd like to congratulate the winners, of course, but also all the nominees. Getting a nomination in this company reflects our esteem for the quality of your performance, or for the element of the play for which you were involved. So well done to you all. We look forward to seeing more of your work in due course. So that's it for another year, or rather 2 years, because we shall be open for entries again in September 2021, we hope. And our next Phoebe Rees Awards evening will be at the Taunton Rugby Club in October 2022. Meanwhile, keep safe, and our very best wishes to you all.
Bye.
Bye.
And from me, good night.